Are you?
Hey, I'm hanging in there. How's it going for
Good,
you?
good. I'm good. Thank you. I'm so excited to talk with you today. First, I'm going to hold up this gorgeous piece of publishing. Like, oh my gosh, this book is so stunning.
Yeah, do you love it?
It's
I put
so
a lot of
moving.
work into it.
How long did it take you? Tell me about where
Hmm.
this idea for the book came from and how long you've been working on it. Called Deep Ruts. Tell me about the title,
Oh,
all of
yeah,
it.
I mean, the whole shebang. I started working on deep Ruts uh I think in like maybe a more air quote official capacity in grad school. I was trying to figure out like what did being an artist mean? What did I want to use my artistry for, my photography skills? And at the time, I had recently come out, like publicly and to my family. Um, and it was a very difficult experience for me. I felt very isolated. I felt like I couldn't belong to my culture or to my family. And so that's what really started this photographic journey, but also like a healing journey and a growing journey for myself. Like, um, what, what did it mean for me to define myself outside of the stories or circumstances I was born into. And as you can see in the book Deep Ruts, like there's a very rich history of coal mining. And so I had a lot of questions like, what does it mean to be, the child of a coal miner? And I'm queer and an artist. And, there's lots of like laborers and homemakers and teachers in my family. And so Deep Ruts was about how do I fit and how do I, yeah, make sense of my life within these ruts that have been carved for me. But also the title, like I feel like really holds a lot of different meanings, which is one of my favorite parts. This I've been working on this project for since 2013, like in an official capacity, and there's a few images in the book from like 2010. Um, and ruts was something that was also just became like a visual thing, like the ruts from four wheelers and ATVs, carving through the hills, or the ruts from cows and deer walking their paths, right? Or like a deer and rut. And so, of course, hunting is like a very big theme in my family as well. So that's how I kind of came up with deep ruts. And it really was able to touch on the deep ruts of like religion that are in my family, but also like the deep ruts of the stories that we tell about ourselves, either as a family or as individuals, the stories I was telling about myself or my own beliefs. And so I feel like the entire book was really just about like, what does it mean to make your own meaning out of life?
Where did you grow up?
So I originally grew up in the southwest part of West Virginia, in Mingo County until I was about 8 or so. And then we moved to Franklin County, Virginia, just south of Roanoke. And so, those two spaces are really where I spent most of my childhood. And then, all my family remains in West Virginia primarily. And, like when I, air quote, go home to visit, like that's where I go home and I spend lots of time there.
How much or were you exposed to art as a child?
Um, I was exposed to like different types of art, like maybe art that we wouldn't sort of call like capital A art, or like maybe wasn't exposed to the art that I learned in undergrad or grad school. But part of the Deep Roots journey is actually realizing there was a lot more artistic influence in my life than I realized. One, being my family, like, my family's full of musicians and carpenters and builders and welders and, creators. And then, of course, like where I grew up in Southwest Virginia, just south of Roanoke, there's like a very rich legacy of folk art. So like, yeah, lots of bluegrass and like glass blowing and stuff like that. So I was exposed to it, but as far as like this sense of access or money or even sort of like an ushering into other arts or an encouragement, I feel like it wasn't quite what I needed at that age.
But it sounds like you didn't even recognize, right, that you needed it. And then I'm curious as to how did you come to wanting to major or study art? And how was that received in your family?
Yeah. How did I like come to figure it out? That's a good question. Or like, well, I guess I didn't recognize it at the time that that was like something that I needed. But I think it was always the thing I was trying to articulate over time. So like anytime there would be an art class offered in like middle school or high school, I would take it and I loved it. And so, I actually was a very terrible artist before I found photography and, you know, my art teachers told me so. Um, and I think once I found photography, that was a bit of a green light that discovery kind of happens towards like the middle to end of high school. But it kind of starts off as just like a really fun interest and even like maybe a tool for freedom, like just to like get in the car and go drive around the country with my friends and take pictures and, you know, not be near my parents. When I first started college, I actually started as an interior designer because there was a practical application to it, right? Like that I could make money with something slightly artistic, but, um, you know, and it made sense to me and it made sense to my family. And once I like picked photography, I think there was like a concern of about like how it could support me, you know, in my day to day life. And that type of support and um, like full time jobs with good benefits and stuff is a big thing in my family, right? Like that safety, that security, and I think my parents were like worried, like it because they're not super involved in the photography world, so they don't know what it has to offer. But also, like I didn't know what it had to offer either. You know, in the world of photography is super broad, and I was just this like you know young kid from you know rural spaces who maybe didn't have access to folks who could tell me about that. Um, but the cool thing about my parents is that, like, even though maybe they haven't always understood photography or why I would pick it or that it doesn't make me money, they were just like thrilled that I wanted to get an education and they were so excited to support me in that. And they're like, if it's photography, great. Okay. At least you're in school. At least you're doing the thing. Because not a whole lot of folks in my family uh, went to college or finished school due to whatever circumstances you know we've all come up against. And so I think my parents were just like, "Heck yeah, you're going to college, and you didn't have a premature pregnancy, and you're not on drugs. Total win." And so I don't think my parents like quite understand it, but they, you know, my dad sends me photos of sunsets, and he's like, yeah, isn't this awesome? I'm like, dude, that's killer. So that's like kind
That,
of the journey to it.
yeah, I mean that's really touching. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how many people are out there that are feeling the same way, which is I don't really fit in. Where do I belong? How can I
Hmm.
belong? How did you persevere? You know, what would you tell that person in you? And I feel a little bit, and tell me if I'm wrong, that your book is speaks to that individual, is speaking to that individual, right? And so, how could you articulate today, um, either misconceptions or what was it that enabled you to just keep pushing and pursuing this path of photography?
Honestly, spite.
Uh,
No, just kidding. Stubbornness and spite. But like there was something really magical about photography that I like really couldn't deny. And I think as someone, you know, I feel like in American families, this is not just like a rural versus urban or metropolitan. Like we really don't talk about feelings at all. And I think in my family, I thought we talked about feelings and I thought we talked about important things. But as, you know, I started to grow up and expand, I'm like, oh, like we're actually really not talking. And I mean, I wasn't even talking. And to some degree, like that's one of my failures is that I'm still not having the most direct conversations. But photography for me was like a place where I could start to like articulate those feelings, but also like put my feelings in, right? Like I was angry that I felt isolated. I was angry that I didn't feel like I belonged to my family or my culture. And so I think using photography was a way to work through those things. And ultimately, I think pairing like with photography and therapy, and also time is that like, I think belonging it might be a lot more simple than we think. I think is potentially what I've learned through all of this. And this is just, I mean, it's my particular situation, but I realized that like some of the stories I had been telling about myself or my family or the world was why I wasn't fitting into my world. And I started to interrogate what about those may or may not be true. Um, and so for me, I just kind of realized like, oh, just because this is a story we've told about ourselves doesn't make it the operative reality. And so once I started sort of suspending those stories and trying to be present, let's say with my dad, for example, and being more direct and like, I'm like, oh, actually my dad's just a human too, trying his best. And so am I. And like, um, so I think that's like part of my belonging journey. And I think there's a spiritual aspect. Um, and I'm getting all this to the advice part of like belonging and continuing to persevere in your art form is that like, what is it? It's a James Baldwin quote. Like I've, I was alone in my pain until I started reading and then I realized like I wasn't alone at all. And so I feel like art and literature and things like that really remind us that we all belong together and we all share like very similar things. And there are folks out there for you that can hold your pain but also hold your joy.
That's beautiful. I wrote down belonging to culture or family. You didn't feel that belonging, and then you said it could be more simple than that. What do you
Yeah.
mean?
I feel like a lot of the narratives about like, I think we'll just say like Appalachian queerness is that, mainstream media and sort of like, let's say your average Joe zeitgeist is that like those two things are antithetical, or, that they must be extremely tenuous or they must be a number of things. And then I just started like interrogating my own experience. And I realized like, actually, there were a lot more queer folks in my spaces growing up than I realized. But the narrative of like homophobia or white supremacy made them invisible to me or made them undesirable to get to know, right? Like those are the things that kind of kept me from my own identity. And so once I could start of like peeling that back, I was like, oh, there's tons of us and there's a lot of nuance that's happening. You know, there's homophobia and transphobia everywhere is also part of the thing I'm learning, like these larger truths, like it's not just in Appalachia with queer folks, like that's an American thing. Um, and yeah, I just realized like I actually was like I thrived in my own way as a queer person in those spaces at that time, right? Like I had queer peers in basketball and there's just a lot of like nuance and these really pockets of these things. And I was like, well, the truth of my experience doesn't match the truth of the narrative that has been told to me my entire life. And so then I just started bringing it back to the truth of my story, but also the truth of my peers' stories. Like through photography, I've made lots of peers who are queer in Appalachian or queer in rural or, immigrants who are also queer. And it's just like, yeah, actually, like not all of our families are persecuting us. Not all of our families are doing these things. And in fact, there's just like nuance, man. It's all over the place. And the truth of experience to me is becoming more powerful than the truth of the myth, I guess.
So
and yeah,
I wrote down something interesting. You said it's an American thing. Explain that, because I have a little side story that I was like nodding when you said that. So it's an American thing. Why is it why do you say that?
like why homophobia is an American thing. Yeah, I feel like most of the isms are like very American, and I can only speak to an American culture, which is why I'm saying that, and because that's what I live and breathe in. Uh, but yeah, lots of really brilliant Black thought leaders and Indigenous thought leaders have really shown us that some of our ways of operating in this American system are deeply harmful, and it comes with the isms, right? Homophobia, transphobia, racism. And I think in the broad narrative, Americans want to say, like, well, incest belongs to the rural, or incest belongs to the Appalachians, and homophobia belongs to, like, these certain type of church folks, and transphobia right? Like, and it's actually like, that's just part of our culture. It doesn't really matter whether you're born in an urban space, suburban, like, there are no true ways of escaping it. And so really just sort of like wanting to point to a certain group as a scapegoat is not helpful, I don't think. And so that's why I say, like, it's an American thing. And all of these things happen across all of America, and you can't really pinpoint it on a certain group. Does that answer that question?
It does. Yeah. And the
Yeah.
reason why I said that, it stuck out for me, because I have, in another discussion that I had, my nephew, spent 10 years living in Paris and married a man who was born and raised in Paris, and they moved back here a couple years ago. And in talking to his husband said, in Paris, we don't care what you are, who you are. That's your business. That's your life.
Your business.
It's not my life. And it was so interesting hearing him go down that explanation on how we as Americans focus so much on what somebody else is doing, how they're living their life. It's this cultural phenomenon. But I hope, and I don't know, I've got two teenagers who are quick to call out anytime I or my husband say something that they perceive as an ism. And they're very open and welcoming to a diverse group of friends, which I think is so lovely and teaches me. It certainly wasn't the case when I was even growing up. You didn't mix races, you didn't date someone that wasn't your same religion, those kinds of things. So I don't know. I hope we continue to go in that accepting realm and we don't slide back. But I'm going to move on from that, because this is an arts podcast and I'm not going to get down into those weeds too often. But you said spite. I said, what? So maybe I am going down in those weeds. You spite toward who or what?
Hey, I think anything and everything. I think I'm just somehow, and who knows where it comes from, or maybe I think it must come from just many generations of Appalachians having to do whatever it took for their own survival. But I think I was like, you're not going to tell me who I can be and what I can do. And I think, like, for example, like, it was a bit tough to like, I was a quite naive person for a long time, or sheltered, or, whatever, right? Like, I grew up in a conservative rural area. And, when I came, let's say, to Ohio State, I think there was a little bit of, like, what would the word be? Like, perhaps prejudice towards my, like, ruralness or my accent, or like a perceived whatever. And I think I just really felt like I deserve to be here as much as you. And it took me a lot more to get here. And so the spite is like, I can't wait to show you how wrong you are. And that's been a really powerful motivator for me. But I think there's also like a sense of like proving to myself, right? Like a dedication and devotion to myself, saying like, no matter what anyone's told me, I'm gonna get what I want. And I think that's part of like what stories matter to me and what stories are going to stagnate me in this life. And I think the spite is that I will not allow anything to stagnate me.
Stagnation is a good word. I think that our sector, the creative arts sector as a whole, is a bit stagnant. Thus, the title of this podcast, Arts Redefined. We need to redefine what we think of the arts if we want to resonate. I'm want to lead a renaissance of relevance, and if we viewed your work, your studies, the photography as relevant, that would help with the resources and revenue, right? Then we wouldn't have to think about, can you provide for yourself? What are the benefits? Why in the world would you pursue this area? So in that vein, what skills did you learn as an art major or photography that can be applied to any discipline or industry? Because that's one of my mantras is, if you're not creative, you can't be innovative. And if we want to be the most innovative, we've got to be the most creative. So talk to me a little bit about what you think of when I say those phrases.
Well, man, I think of a lot of things. I think like so there's a couple of questions in there. I think I'll start with like just some of the basic skills I learned in school, in which um critical thinking, or suspending what you think you know, and kind of showing up and being present for whatever's in front of you, and like really looking and observing and listening without judgment. And then, judgment can arrive later. There's always, I've also learned that each thing has a function and it's a tool, not necessarily like a way of life, right? Like what I just said, like that's just a tool. Like I know that judgment is a tool in my toolkit, but is now the time to use that tool. And so I've been able to sort of flesh out, what type of tools and assets that art can give me as a human, and not necessarily, like a literal one-to-one skill that can be, like physically applied into the world. But I also think communication and articulation has been an incredible part of my artistic practice that, honestly, I mean, most people in a corporate field do not have. And actually, tons of artists fail to cultivate, I think, because they want the art to stand for itself. And I mean, I get that. I mean, that is the ultimate artistic desire, right? That, like, you don't have to convey anything and people just get it. But that's not realistic. And so I think communication, and being able to articulate, this is why I do it, this is what it's about. And I've learned that there's also still room for your own interpretation of my book, right? Like, even if I explain it all to you, you're still going to glean so much richness from it, that I probably will never know. But me still being able to do my 3 to 5 minute articulation of like, this is why it's important, right? It's that relevance piece where I say like, this is why it's relevant to you and to me. I think empathy is something that one gets from arts education. But I feel like maybe that's something that I was already cultivating on my own. And then the arts pairing with it was very, very good. But I feel like, if I were to renegotiate what arts education is, that would be an aspect that I put in there. I'm just rambling on.
No. I mean, those were all right on target, and really poignant and important, which then you talk about your work, and your work often focuses on or identity and memory. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
got, deep ruts. And so how do you choose the subjects you want to capture and portray?
For me, I think one of my grad school teachers once was talking about photography and like, or maybe just art in general, about how it's like kind of a rumination and obsession, and that there's always this thing that the artist is circling or thinking about. And I think that small example allowed me to say, well, like, what do I keep returning to? Like, whether it's on purpose or not. And and for me, I was like, my intuition and my gut is going to lead me there. And so, yeah, like what are the things I kept obsessing over? And I was like, those are the things I have to make art about, because one of my core beliefs as an artist, at least from my own practice, is like, if it doesn't come from a personal place of investment, one, what is the point? And two, it's just not going to be compelling or interesting to anybody else. Um, I'm not interested in making a certain type of like sanitized or super intellectual art, because that's just like not who I am as a person. I think bringing the heart to it is one of the main importances.
The self portraits were very personal and raw and honest. How did you get there? How did you have the courage to portray yourself in that realm? And then the more I contemplated them, they were very beautifully emotional.
I like that. Thank you. Um, I think there's a few things at play with that. One is when I think about photography or the history of photography or the power dynamics of photography, it feels important for me to be as vulnerable in front of the camera as anyone else I would ask to sit. Like, if I'm not willing to do it, then I have no business asking you to do it. I think is kind of one of my ethos. I like that sense of equality or integrity or whatever you want to call it. And then another aspect was like, I really just didn't see myself in my worlds or in the world, and photography was my desperate reach for myself, being like, who am I? Am I allowed to be this? What if I see myself like this? But it also was like one of the only arenas I felt like I could stand up for myself, right? Like, very conflict avoidant family, which I've been like really working at for many, many years. And so that's where I could have conflict and feeling and maybe not have to censor myself in such a way. Like, and as you can see, like, there's maybe like a hardness in some of those or an anger. And it's like, yeah, I was pissed off. And so, this was a space where I could have that type of healthy anger. And then I think there was a third component to it about, you said, like, how could I do it? How could I be courageous? How could I do this thing? I think there was an aspect where like, I just didn't have a choice. There's like very much this driving factor, like in my personhood. But as far as like, a lot of folks call me courageous, particularly in my art. And I am emotionally vulnerable in a way that maybe some folks are not, but I love to contextualize my courage in that, like, I am an artist who has worked a 9 to 5 corporate job that's as shitty as they've been, have been fairly cushy. And so, like, I just think about all the coal miners and rail laborers and mamas in my family, and just like, man, this is a privilege and this stuff is fun, and there's not a whole lot that's scary about it. But what's scary to me is thinking that, I could have had to go work in the coal mines for $20 an hour and, you know, work overtime and become disabled at a younger age or whatever, right? Like, I'm like, this is not true fear, or like, I think about folks who are persecuted over and over again, whether it's Black folks in America or Palestinians overseas. And it's like, well, I'm a white kid making art. It's okay. That's not truly scary. And I think it's really helpful to get really real. I try to get really real with myself. And I'm like, standing in front of my camera naked, talking about my feelings is not the worst thing in the world. In fact, it can only be helpful, I think.
What do you say to those artists who think about the reaction of the viewer rather than always coming from your true artistic vision? Or do you ever think that way? Do you think about how will people respond to this?
I think about how people respond to things often, particularly like, what would my mom think or what would my dad think? And I mean, those are the scariest barometers
Right.
for me, right? Like, I think we all remain deeply terrified of our parents to some degree. But I think there's something that maybe time and maturity you get to as an artist in that, like, I think I've discovered, like, I want people to love it, and like, I'll make a photo and I'm like, this is a banger, everyone's gonna love it, right? But I didn't make it because I knew it was gonna be a banger. I made it for me, and then later on I was like, oh, that's killer. And I think what I've learned is, like, if you're not really making it from your true sense of self, then it will not be successful. Whether it, like, at least to me, artistic success is not, there's lots of barometers, money, notoriety, but I want people to really connect with my art and to connect with me and maybe have a conversation or just feel something. And if you're doing it for someone else, you failed the mission already. It fails before it begins, is my feeling. And so, but that's my own approach. Like, I am an artist who makes from my heart, and not everyone's artistic practice is like that. So it might not apply, but those are my feelings and thoughts.
Well, that definitely comes through in your book and your photographs. And as I said, they're moving and vulnerable, from a girl who was born in a city, to a conservative Catholic parents. Thank you for allowing me to experience a taste of your life and upbringing, because it certainly makes me richer emotionally for that. So thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a great example of, like, because I made this project with my own sort of artistic truth at the helm, it is connecting with, you're probably several years older than me. You have children, right? Like, you grew up Catholic in a city, very different, but there's something about my project that you connect with and feel as truth. And like, I've had many different folks of different experiences say, like, this book is important to me. And I didn't even have any type, like, not even close to this experience, right? Because there's like a human element, right? I'm talking about belonging. I'm talking about wanting my mother and father to love me with true love unconditionally. Like, shit like that. That's all we're all ever talking about, is like, we want our families to love us. We want community. We want friendship. And it's like, I think just being really honest about our human needs is what can make art really good.
Very good. So this is the part of the podcast where I turn to my last two questions that I ask of everyone. So let's have fun with it.
Let's do it.
How do you define art?
Oh, I think art is really broad, but I think I just came up with this in a panel the other day. I feel like art is the playground, where play and agency can, like, really come together. When I say agency, like, it's a playground for discovering the agency of the self, right? Like, I have the power to make this drawing or this watercolor or this photograph, and whether it's good or bad, like, I don't even think that's important. I think the making is what's important. So I think for me, art is about connecting to your own human spirit.
What color do you love the most and why?
What? The hardest question anyone's ever asked me.
Wow.
Well, it's like an art nerd what their favorite color is. Okay. If I had to just like pick one, I've really been drawn to orange these last few years. Like any type of orange, kind of bright orange or like a burnt orange. And I think it's because it's very like visually stimulating to me and fun.
Perfect.
What's
Wow.
yours?
Green.
Ooh, will you tell me
It's
why?
well, it's interesting. It's always been green. And I have been thinking a lot about why, because I've been asking this question. And I grew up playing tennis and I loved tennis, but I wonder if it's that because I wonder, associate green with tennis a little bit, but
Yeah.
there's something about it that it just feels positive and safe and calming to me.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah. And I'm drawn to weird greens, not just like the typical green, but I love weird off color greens. But yeah, green.
Amazing.
Yes.
Excellent choice.
Thank you. There can't really be a wrong answer with that, right? That's
Well,
why I love it.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, no wrong answers at all.
Perfect. Well, Julie Rae, thank you so much for your time. We will have a link to where you can purchase Deep Ruts in the show notes. Get it. It's fantastic. It's a great gift for yourself or to gift it to others, especially if you are drawn to photography. It's a wonderful coffee table book. Very moving. So thank you, Julie Rae. I appreciate you joining me today.
Of course. Thank you.